We got things started on this topic in our last video, so if you missed that, definitely be sure to go back and watch it after you watch this one, but today we're finishing things off here. Basically, we're going through all 30 NBA teams, picking out their biggest regrets of the 2024 season, because while some teams have obviously made better decisions than others, overall no team is perfect, so everybody has at least one thing they wish they would have done differently in hindsight. In our last video, we went through the teams in the Eastern Conference, so today we're finishing up with the teams in the Western Conference. Before we start though, it turns out a good amount of you watching right now aren't even subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoyed the content, consider hitting the subscribe button, as not only does it help out a ton, but it also very much appreciate it. Now with that being said, let's begin. Going in alphabetical order, we'll start with the Dallas Mavericks, and their biggest regret of the year is acquiring Grant Williams in the offseason. Of course, the Mavericks did eventually right this ship here by moving Williams in a trade deadline deal for PJ Washington, and now they're in the NBA Finals, so it all worked out in the end. But early on in the season, the addition of Grant Williams was just not working out at all. Williams was brought in to bolster their defense, but by December he had lost his starting spot, and reports had come out about how Williams' personality just seemed to rub everybody the wrong way in the locker room, so they would avoid going through all of that altogether if they could have a do-over. Next is the Denver Nuggets, and their biggest regret of the season is ignoring the backup center position. After winning it all last season, the Nuggets essentially chose to run it back with what they had, minus Bruce Brown, and this year their lack of depth behind Nikola Jokic caught up with them. DeAndre Jordan was the only other real big man behind him on their roster, and he is as washed as it gets for a few years now, so he didn't even play all that much, and the alternative of small ball lineups got eaten alive when Jokic went to the bench, both in the regular season and the playoffs. Up next is the Golden State Warriors, and their biggest regret of the year is blindly riding their veterans so often throughout the season instead of giving their young guys more of a chance. The Warriors dug themselves a tough hole to get out of early in the season, and even though they did almost overcome it by sneaking into the play-in tournament, they ultimately missed the playoffs. Andrew Wiggins and Klay Thompson both had a pretty objectively poor seasons, yet were consistently trusted to close out big minutes in big games when guys like Jonathan Kuminga and Brendan Pajemski were both flourishing in limited roles and only started to be trusted more when it was too late. Next is the Houston Rockets, and their biggest regret of the year is paying Fred VanVleet a max contract. VanVleet was brought in because the Rockets wanted to finally try to take the next step away from rebuilding and compete for a playoff spot. Unfortunately for them though, he didn't really play up to the standards that a max guy should provide, putting up a respectable 17 points and 8 assists per game, but not borderline all-star caliber production. And with them not even making the play-in tournament, their minimal progress probably was not worth the overpay. Next is the Los Angeles Clippers, and their biggest regret is locking Kawhi Leonard into a supermax contract extension before seeing out how their new core would work together. Kawhi Leonard was originally brought to the Clippers 5 years ago to help bring this historically low franchise to the NBA Finals, but he's missed most of each of the last 3 playoff runs due to injury, and his best days definitely seem to be behind him. The Clippers chose to give Kawhi a 3-year extension worth $153 million midway through this season, but their season ended in a first-round exit, and now they're at risk of losing Paul George to free agency. The team's headed in the wrong direction, with all of their money tied up in a core that hasn't been able to get the job done. Next is the Los Angeles Lakers, and their biggest regret of the season is choosing to stay put at the trade deadline. The Lakers were one of the teams most heavily featured in trade deadline rumors, as they were underperforming at the time and needed a jolt to get them back into contention, but they ended up doing nothing, keeping the team together as is, and while they did play a bit better in the second half of the season, they were still a play-in team that got eliminated in the first round, and now LeBron James' time in LA might be up in the air as he hits free agency. Next is the Memphis Grizzlies, and their biggest regret of the year is trading away Tyus Jones. In previous seasons, the Grizzlies were always able to survive the time that Ja Morant would miss due to injury, and Tyus Jones stepping into his role in his absence was a big reason why. The Grizzlies traded Tyus Jones away in a deal that landed them Marcus Smart, hoping he could keep them afloat, but they started off the year in a huge, dreadful losing streak, and it became very clear they desperately missed Tyus Jones' playmaking ability, as the team also finished the season with the league's worst ranked offense. Up next is the Minnesota Timberwolves, and their biggest regret of the year is never finding a playable backup point guard. The Timberwolves made a great run to the conference finals this year, but one area they struggled with in big moments was consistent playmaking outside of Anthony Edwards. Mike Conley is a savvy veteran who still does very well running the offense, but at his age, he's not playing 40 minutes a night, and without him on the court, the Wolves didn't have any other playable point guards to run things, which made Anthony Edwards' life even tougher. Next is the New Orleans Pelicans, and their biggest regret of the year also happens to be the fact that they never went out and got a real point guard for their lineup. Back-to-back teams we see that ignored one of the most important positions on the court and got burned because of it. The Pelicans have thrust CJ McCollum into a point guard role that he's never really been naturally fit for, as he's always been more of a combo guard, and Jose Alvarado is the only other point guard on their roster, and he's only good for brief stints off the bench. Next is the Oklahoma City Thunder, and their biggest regret is not taking a bigger swing at the trade deadline. The Thunder have an infinite supply of draft picks and trade assets at their disposal, so when it became clear that they were a team capable of contending this year, they really should have tried to make the most of it by going after some top talent at the trade deadline. Instead, their biggest move was bringing in washed Gordon Hayward, who couldn't even break into their rotation, and as the 1 seed, made it to just the second round in the playoffs. Up next is the Phoenix Suns, and their biggest regret of the year is trading for Bradley Beal. The Suns went all in on a big three of star talent and learned the hard way that the days of talent winning above all else is over, as they finished as just the 6th seed in the West and got swept in the first round by the Timberwolves. They now have no money to spend on role players to round out their rotation in a meaningful way, no trade assets that would land them anything valuable, and are due to pay $50 million per year to a version of Bradley Beal that is no longer even an all-star caliber guy. Next is the Portland Trail Blazers, and their biggest regret is holding on to Malcolm Brogdon all season instead of trading him. Brogdon was brought to Portland as a part of the Jrue Holiday trade, and the expectation was that he too would be moved at some point in order to acquire even more assets as the Blazers shift into their rebuild. While he is a solid veteran to have around their young team, the reality is that he is still the kind of player that can help a contending team make a playoff run, so it felt strange to see him stay put. Up next is the Sacramento Kings, and their biggest regret of the year is extending Harrison Barnes' contract. The Kings ended their playoff drought last season only to find themselves back on the outside looking in this year. They need more firepower around De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis, and they also need more defensive help, and locking in $18 million annually to Harrison Barnes, who is mediocre at best in both of those regards, is one way to secure mediocrity. Next is the San Antonio Spurs, and their biggest regret of the year is paying a hefty contract extension to Zach Collins. The Spurs locked in Collins to 2 more years after this one because in theory they wanted him to be paired with Victor Wembanyama in their front court, but the issue is that after starting their first 20 games of the season together, it became very clear that they were not a pairing that worked well together on the court. The Spurs got outscored by 12.2 points per 100 possessions with the two of them on the court together, but a much more manageable 0.5 points per 100 possessions with just Wembanyama on the court, so now Collins is being paid $17 million annually to be a backup. And finally, the last team is the Utah Jazz, and their biggest regret of the year is trading for John Collins. Obviously, the logic behind the trade for Collins was pretty sound since they barely had to give anything up for him, and they had just rejuvenated Lauri Markkanen's career, so they fully believed they could do the same with him. But ultimately, Collins' fit was much clunkier, and the payoff was not worth committing 2 more years to him moving forward. The Jazz have a bevy of young talent that the team likely would have preferred to be giving minutes to, but because Collins is still owed $26 million annually, he's going to be the one getting those minutes. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below what you think the biggest regrets of the year are. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.